distinguished guests, members, friends of the Schiller Institute, welcome to the second day of this historic conference. My name is Stefan Ossenkop. I am a member of the Schiller Institute. I direct some of the institutional outreach in our capital, Berlin office. And I'm going to be the moderator of this third panel. We'll hear from four distinguished speakers. From France, we have Jacques Cheminade. From Austria, we have Professor Hans Köchler. From Italy, we have Marco Zanni. And from Germany, Dr. Armin Azima. I will give you more background and introduce the speakers in more detail as they come to the podium. The panel is called The Future of European Nations, a Cultural and Economic Great Design Within the New Paradigm. And the first speaker is going to be Jacques Cheminade, who is the founder and president of Solidarité et Progrès, a party in France. He is a 3 times presidential candidate in the French presidential elections, and he was the first person to bring up the danger of a financial crisis in France publicly in the year of 1995. He fought through the ideas of banking separation and public credit to revive the physical economy. His speech is called Europe's Future Needs to be Inclusive with the New Silk Roads and the World Landbridge. Please welcome with me Mr. Jacques Cheminade.
Thank you very much. Let's be clear. Let's be clear this morning, and let's be clear for all of us. The European Union has become a walking shadow, a moral corpse. In Italian, you may say, è morto chi parla. But it would be self-destructive to fall into a state of morose delectation, into the comfort of blaming ourselves and doing nothing. Second to the British Empire, pessimism is our main enemy because it paralyzes our will. Beyond all criticism, there is the idea and the contribution of Europe to human civilization, which is absolutely different and opposed to the European Union. It is a Europe of the nations, a multiple having generated a one, an immortal contribution to humanity that the world needs. Our task is to awaken such a Europe from its present nightmare, to bring it out from the valley of the clueless where it stagnates and turn it into a new beacon of hope, illuminating the world's sick roads. De Gaulle did not fear to say that the princess of the legends, France, should be mobilized to build the European cathedral. But for real, and as a metaphor, a cathedral is not a closed shop. It is a landmark for all those who are outside and a place to conceive, pray, and work hard for a better world for all those who enter, and more to say so for all those that are outside. We are far from that, very far from that. But because of the world situation, we are not allowed to lose. And this may sound strong in the present Europe, we are not allowed to lose. And to win, we first have to look inward and from above, make an examination of conscience, a joyful examination of conscience, because to reach above our state of mind towards the needed relatively higher states, to reach beyond our present state of mind, will free us from the shackles of impotence and recover our self-esteem. Let's commit ourselves to arise from the mud of our European Waterloo. Since more than 30 years, our leaders have neither responded to the demand of their peoples, nor met the challenges of the international situation. As a result, we are withdrawing from change and engaging in a process of balkanization and of decomposition of our identity. We have submitted ourselves to the empire of the City of London and Wall Street, letting them ruin ourselves and our neighbors in Africa and in the Middle East, and then blaming the human beings escaping from those places ruined by our policies, blaming them to our misfortunes and woes. What hypocrisy! What hypocrisy on the part of our governments, and also, and I mean it, in those that stay without reacting. What an hypocrisy. At the last European Council of June 28 and 29, a few days ago, our leaders reduced the question of migrants to a thing in itself, trying to transfer to their partners what all see as a burden, without the least commitment to a minimum solidarity. The agreement that they have reached is worse than nothing. It pretends to be something, but it delivers nothing except words, words, words. Some want to assemble migrants for control in hotspots located in European countries. Others want to subcontract the problem to the countries where the migrants are coming from. All are unable to conceive anything but hotspots, which are nothing but human triage camps, rather than treating the real causes of migrations. Our leaders throw statistics and figures at each other's faces, reducing human lives to accounting evaluations. Italy had to abandon Mare Nostrum at the end of 2014, which was the relatively best humanitarian operation organized by a state because of absolute lack of European support. All ended up delegating the job to the NGOs and now blame them as accomplices of the smugglers. Logically, in that context, European ports are closed to the ships carrying the migrants. Migrants are either going to be disembarked in third countries' platforms, as they call them, third countries' platforms, or in controlled centers, as they call them, of reception inside European states. But it is an illusion. It is an illusion to think that it will solve the dilemma. And the common denominator is triage. And all European leaders have to be blamed for the criminal inaction of the countries. I first decided to raise this moral issue, which is also a political issue or a reflection of a higher political issue, because a union of states in which no member considers migrations as a challenge to be solved through massive help in favor of the countries where the migrants are coming from. An union where no one organizes itself properly to receive those that come as a potential for the future, such a union that has lost its mandate of heaven, its mandate from heaven, as the Chinese would say. We have lost, at the present moment, as a European Union, our mandate of heaven. All European nations share a political conception of our planet as being a relatively finite universe, a sort of lifeboat which has a limited space to contain a growing population. That is indeed the real problem of the European Union. It doesn't produce wealth, it doesn't produce children, and does not welcome foreigners, because it has accepted the rule of a zero-sum universe, a sort of fortress Europe against the people, but friendly to financial speculations, with a euro that has become their conveyor belt. All European reformers and the so-called populists alike, with a few exceptions, are trying to solve a problem within the terms that have created the problem. None faces the cause, which are the policies of the British Empire, Wall Street, and the City of London. Macron has exhibited an oratory talent at the French Sorbonne University or in Greece at the PNIX, but only dealing with words, 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 and not with reality. He calls for a refoundation of Europe, but within the realm of financial liberalism. He was not capable of endorsing Glass-Steagall, a Glass-Steagall Act, when he had the opportunity to do so as an advisor to François Hollande, and later finance minister to Hollande. Nor today, even though at least part of the Italian ministers and many of their advisors are calling for it. Macron pretends to be a lead climber, but in reality, he's begging for German money to be able to climb. While Angela Merkel messes around with her government and covers up for financial interests which are like the Deutsche Bank, potentially bankrupt. Others go in all directions with no vision. None has the courage to see beyond its own nostrils. So how can we here be morally and culturally optimistic? Because if we look beyond our terrible state of domestic affairs, since September 2013, there is a new development, a new model for relations among major powers who has been set forth, the model of the new Silk Roads. Let's repeat it again, again, and again. Helga opened up the conference with that, and we should repeat it in our minds to understand what it is as a dynamics. This model is based on the principle of the absolute respect for the sovereignty of the others. It is a new world order based on mutual trust and benefit. The intention expressed by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is to transcend the outdated concepts of the clash of civilizations and the Cold War, to go beyond the mere thinking in the geometry of zero-sum games or exclusive clubs like the G7, the so-called G7. It is precisely and necessarily the model that should inspire us in Europe today. Emmanuel Macron, during his January trip to China, said in his Xi'an speech that we have reached times where France, Europe, and China can afford to dream together, reach a point at which a new Silk Roads reactivate a collective imagination, an imagination to be shared. Well said, well said. But typical of present European ways, he tries to locate this momentum within a liberal financial model. I would say these are the prison bars of his ideology. There you have a clinical example of today's European failed state of mind, trying to put a nightingale in a cage. Totally contrary is the Chinese concept of Tianxia, expanded by Confucius and Mencius, which inspires the policies of Xi Jinping, establishing that when something new comes from outside, it should be adopted inside with an approach which is neither that of an exclusive club nor of a closed shop, but with a dynamic motion creating the conditions for a higher level of coexistence. Politics is not, as some would believe, domination by mere force, but the art to create a global cooperation. That's the spirit of Tianxia. It is therefore not uniformization or domination, but what's called in Chinese philosophical terms, complementarity. It's complementarity, with the qualities of inclusiveness, connectivity, and attractiveness. Ha! Some would say in Europe, there you come with an Asian model. Are you sure it will fit for Europe? The answer is no, not only for Europe, it will fit, and it's going to fit for the whole world. Why am I so sure? Because our great European philosopher Leibniz understood it. He wrote in his Novissima Sinica and in various letters to his Jesuit friends that he sent to China, that the concept of social harmony from the Chinese would enrich and be necessary for European culture. The opportunity was missed then, sabotaged by the feudal oligarchy and the British financiers. But it has left its marks, its footsteps in our Europe. And I have many quotes that I have no time to bring to you from French writers and German writers from the 18th and 17th and 18th century, which have read Confucius and were trying to conceive what a state ruled by Confucian concepts should be. So it is there in our memory. Interestingly, the concept of complementarity meets the Leibnizian one of completedness, not a destructive uniformization, but a mutually inspiring harmony. For the West today, it is evidently difficult to grasp this new dynamic of the Silk Roads. The truth is that Europe, as reflected in the question of the migrants, is trapped in the old paradigm of geopolitical and the so-called free and fair competition, which is something that has never really existed. In a provocative book called The Rape of Europe, Robert Salé, a French historian, describes how right from the beginning, the European Union was under the double rule of free trade and worse, financial liberalization, against the very conception of the sovereign nation states. This is my point. Europe should be freed from this financial and ideological cage, as exemplified by the case of Macron and about all European leaders. We could say that Europe has to be freed from such an original sin, a sin pushed more and more with a vindictive proselytism absolutely opposed to the Confucian and Leibnizian notion of harmony. The European Union, in other terms, is not a harmonious union, but an inductive, deductive construct based on code standards and rules, which they call instructions, the famous directive in French, instructions. It is based on fixed categories and as such bound to self-destroy, fading into nothing for lack of creativity. Not destroyed by others, but by its own anti-creative axioms, its mental closetedness. I see today's European Union as an endless set of polygons. France, by the way, calls itself an hexagon. A set of polygons unable to get to the superior order of the circle that Cusa described, each polygon seeing itself as a reality or pretending to be the circle, which is even worse, and each seeing itself as a oneness, unable to understand the superior principle of rotation which creates a circle. What angers me the most is to see a counterculture expanding everywhere, banalizing human perception and appetites from ultra-violent video games to the imbecility of world music. The worst example is what Macron organized on the steps of the Élysée Palace to celebrate the Day of Music on June 21st. You won't believe it, but he who pretends to like philosophy and the pomp and riches of the court invited a bunch of DJ stars who transformed the palace in a giant nightclub where they sang such things as, and I quote, Come to dance, you motherfucker, you motherfucker. And let's burn this home tonight. Let's burn it from top down. Burn. He did not say burn, baby, burn, but it was meant the same. Or then, shit everywhere. She was sucking my cock. How good, shit, shit, shit. So that, in a place where Eisenhower, Adenauer, de Gaulle, and others met and were trying to think about the future of the world. In the Élysée today, except Macron and his wife, all were, of course, half naked and hip-hopping, giving the worst image, and that's the worst of it, the worst image of black Africans to an already disoriented population. No wonder that children's concentration span is falling. We were told by a music teacher that the maximum of a child's concentration span today is between 10 and 12 minutes. No wonder the children's concentration span is falling, and except for their attention to these voyeuristic shows, a majority of adults is no longer curious of how others live. This happens in our Europe, where the social points of reference are collapsing in a society controlled by those who pretend to fight for human rights. Europe has lost its positive sense because the ideals of social value are disappearing, and there is no project for a better future. At best, people see the European Union and the Euro as a protection against the others. I would say a sort of giant condom, what the French call capote anglaise. And certainly not as an ode to joy. See Macron pretending to love Europe and playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy like a mantra, while at the same time transforming the Élysée Palace into a giant and depraved nightclub. Again, why am I nonetheless so sure that Europe is fit to join the new paradigm? Because, exemplified by Leibniz, Europe has within it the resources which can be revived and inspired. Europe and the United States and a European project of the best European humanists, have historically been the leaders of an active form of humanism. It is Nicolas de Fontcusse, so dear to Helga Larouche, and that she quoted in her first speech yesterday, who explained how a human mind can create a higher order where all differences are transcended. In his late writings, he referred to it as a posse facere omnia, or the posse ipsum, not knowledgeable by the human mind at a fixed point, but only through the becoming, the moment when human creativity meets the process of the universe, as when the light manifests itself in the visible objects. It is in those moments that a human being is really creatively human, contributing with new discoveries to the future of society, beyond the formal established rules of logics, at a level where what was apparently contradictory is no longer so at a higher order. It is what Cusa called the coincidence of the opposites, an inspiration to reach into the unknown future, something that the instructions of the European Union forbids. You cannot do it according to European directive, rules, and instructions. We can therefore say that as a construct, the European Union has reaped the best of European culture, which our mission is precisely to revive. The higher order in the macrocosm can only exist if there is a maximum possible development of the microcosmos. Human beings should develop each in their maximum way and act in the interest of the other, in the advantage of the other. And all nations should develop alike, each in their maximum way, and act in the interest of each other to have an harmonious world. It is the spirit of the Peace of Westphalia. To overcome war, you have to base your foreign policy on the curiosity for and the interest of the other. It is a principle of a true republic, and it is not only complementary, but it springs from the same cognitive and emotional source as Tianxia. The principle is humanity first, not such and such human, humanity first. The aspiration for human beings and nations alike, whereas Schiller said, duty and passion, necessity and freedom are one. We have that in the storage drawers of our history. So let's stop our petty quarrels. Let's stop behaving like children in a tragic playground and reread our philosophical classics to meet the ones of the East and find our inspiration in Lyndon LaRouche's Earth's Next 50 Years, written in 2004, but being the work of a whole life and reaching through our future. Our future is there, not in the babbling of the European leaders. I would also advise to read Rabelais and Heine, especially Rabelais, to reject the unduly and criminal ruling powers with a weapon of creative laughter, to laugh at them, against all careerists and courtesans regurgitating the answers and moods expected by the principalities and powers of a self-destructive world. Glass-Steagall, a national bank, credit for infrastructure and development, fusion, and the more advanced contributions on science. The four laws of Lyndon LaRouche, not as proselytism to convert. And we were discussing with Elga that Confucianism is not proselytism, it's harmony and the search for harmony. Not as proselytism to convert, but as a common inspiration to build together. Let me end, related to what I said, with a quote of Confucius. If you meet a man of high value, try to be like him. If you meet a mediocre man, try to identify his shortcomings in yourself. This is one of the secrets to reach the Ren, the sovereign good for the advantage of the other. In a harmonious world, to be the true citizen of a republic or of a more perfect union, nor and not its caricature, inhabited today by, I would say, self-satisfied entities. It is our instrument to reach into the future, to rediscover Europe as a pathway to the world Landbridge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll proceed with the second distinguished speaker of today, Professor Hans Köchler. Professor Köchler is a professor of philosophy and former chairman of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Innsbruck. He is the founder and president of the International Progress organization, I.P.O, and has introduced in the year 1972 the concept of a dialogue of civilizations into international relations theory. We're looking forward to his speech. Please, the floor is yours, Professor Köchler.
Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, Mrs. Zepp LaRouche, ladies and gentlemen. As time is short, I will not read out the prepared text. I have forwarded it to the interpreters, but I just must caution them I will not proceed as it is in the text, but the contents anyway are the same, and I will make this text available as from tomorrow online and I shall also give it to the Schiller Institute in case there is a conference publication. I will proceed in 4 steps to meet this challenging task which the organizers have given me, namely to say something about re-establishment of international law. The facts, of course, are clear and obvious. We see almost regularly that countries that are powerful act as they wish. They invade other countries, they destroy the political systems, regime change is one of the buzzwords, and they are not held accountable. The countries are not held accountable, and the leaders who are responsible for the decisions are not held accountable. For me, the most shocking example is what has happened since 2003. The U.S. has never met its responsibility, or has never had to shoulder its responsibility concerning the destruction of Iraq, and the leader in that time has never been brought to justice. So this is a very frustrating situation, and it is obvious that there is no international rule of law in spite of the solemn commitment to this noble principle in the United Nations Charter. So I will try now to meet that challenge put before me in 4 steps. First, we have to be clear about what law is. Unless we know what the nature of law is, we cannot make any assessment about re-establishing it. Second step, the second question I will try here to ask is, are these criteria of law, are the basic elements of law really existing in the field of international law? Yes or no? The third question will be, if in what is called international law, the criteria of law are not met, what are the reasons for this state of affairs? Why is it so that in this by now vast domain of rules and regulations for which we use the notion international law, there is not this nature of law? Why is it so that in fact it is power that rules but not law? And finally, the fourth point, if we have been able to identify the reasons, we may think about what to do about it, how to change that system, how to re-establish international law. But this can only be undertaken if first we know what law is and we know why things went wrong. Otherwise, we will only be led by illusions, and we will always have wrong expectations and blame this United Nations organization for something it is not able to do, or maybe even it was not meant to be able to do. We'll see. First, very briefly, and I have to do that in telegraphic style, I beg your pardon for that. As I said, I have worked that out in more detail and cohesively in the written text. Law is a system of norms that are enforced by the state according to a clear framework of regulations and checks and balances. And that is also what distinguishes a legal norm from a moral norm. If I violate a legal norm, there will be a consequence, there will be a sanction, and this can mean the removal of my freedom, it can mean Financial disadvantages, it can mean many things, and in some countries, depending on the constitution, it can even mean that I will be put to death. Of course, I do not say that legal norms or the legal system is independent of morality. That would be a total misunderstanding. I just say a legal norm has consequences in the real world. A moral norm, if I violate it, there may be consequences in the other world, in the metaphysical world and so on. But still, a system of law, this is my position, must be based on the common good and must be based on human rights, or others would call them on certain natural norms which cannot be changed. That is not the issue here, just to avoid a misunderstanding. So if law is, as I have something which I have described now, the question is, do we have law in this sense in the international field, in relations between states? Is it so that if a state or a leader of a state violates norms of international law, that there will be a sanction and there will be action against the violator? Certainly not. And just let's not forget, in the domestic system, the law is enforced because the state has the executive power to enforce it. That the term coined by Max Weber was Gewaltmonopol. The state possesses the means to enforce the law, and that includes the police and the military. And such a system of enforcement does not exist at the international level. We have enforcement of norms internationally in a very rudimentary form and in a very selective form. If that would be the case in a domestic system, one would say that this is what we call in German Unrechtsstaat. This is a totalitarian state where, for instance, those who have power and privilege or who are wealthy are above the law and nothing is taken against their transgressions. No one would accept that domestically. But internationally, that exactly is the case. And what do I mean by that? Very briefly. So that is now the second step of my reflections. We have enforcement of the law, at least on paper, namely in the United Nations Charter, just in one particular field, and that is about the use of force by one state against another state, including also the threat of the use of force. There is a system of enforcement on which I will speak soon in the United Nations organization. And there is another system of enforcement in terms of criminal justice, I mean international criminal law. But also this system is not complete and is very selective. There is this International Criminal Court, ICC, in The Hague, but it's not really an international court because most of the powerful countries, and I mean also militarily powerful countries, are not members of the court. So the court has no jurisdiction as far as the United States of America are concerned, as far as China is concerned, as far as Russia is concerned, and so on and so forth. Justice or law must be enforced consistently and comprehensively, not selectively. If selective enforcement is, so to speak, the operating modus operandi of a legal system, it does not deserve to be called a system where the rule of law prevails. Because in law there must be no double standards, there must be equality. So that is exactly not the case in regards to international relations. Let me explain why this is so in the third step. As I said, the United Nations Charter has this basic provision that the use of force and the threat of the use of force are illegal under international law. I would say that drafting this norm was really a big step forwards in terms of civilization in relations between states. That, by the way, is not an achievement of the United Nations Organization, just let's be precise. This is an achievement of the post-First World War era. In 1928, the so-called Briand-Kellogg Pact, named after the French foreign minister and the United States foreign minister, entered into force, and that pact, as it is called, or that treaty, stated for the first time in international relations the illegality of the use of force. And that provision has been incorporated into the Charter of the United Nations Organization in 1945. But as I said, it is good to have such a basic norm in the Charter because it's the big issue of war and peace at the global level. But the problem is, of course, the enforcement of this norm. And that is also where a systemic fault is to be identified in the United Nations Charter. And for me, it's amazing why in most of the cases this has been overlooked and why the people do not, or maybe are not able, I don't know, to read the fine print of the Charter. Again, I have to be very brief and I have to simplify it, but the issue is there is a body with almost absolute powers in the United Nations, that is the Security Council. If it adopts decisions under the famous Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, these are decisions on collective security. That means related to the enforcement of the ban on the use of force. First of all, the first problem is that these decisions will only have effect if there is no veto cast by any of the 5 permanent members. That means the United Nations into the United Nations Charter is incorporated the power balance of the year 1945. In the meantime, we have a totally different situation. Those 5 countries, just to name them, the United States, Soviet Union at the time, now Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France, have the privilege in a body that consists of 15 member states. They have the privilege to prevent any decision from being adopted. They are not obliged to give any reasons. It is their sovereign right. Of course, this is absolutely in total contradiction to one of the basic principles of the UN Charter, listed right at the beginning of the Charter, namely sovereign equality of states. There is no sovereign equality if 5 are more equal than all the others. But the big issue here, of course, is that those 5 states that were the most powerful in 1945 do not themselves take or do not need to pay attention to the norm on the non-use of force, because they can prevent any decision for its implementation if it is against their interests. And one has to see this in connection with another provision in the Charter, in this Article 27, paragraph 3, which is almost overlooked by all the people, because the formulation is indirect. It states, and that's really the tricky language of international diplomacy, which one has to understand and one does not have to, one must not tolerate this. this paragraph states that it should be well understood that in decisions under Chapter 6, which are not binding, which are just recommendations, and in some other decisions, the obligation applies that a state that is party to a dispute does not take part in the vote on that dispute. I mean, this is a basic principle of law. I cannot be judge in my own cause. If I have committed, if I have violated the law, I cannot be the judge over my own behavior, of my own behavior. But that's exactly the situation in the Security Council. The Charter states that this obligation to abstain from voting for parties to a dispute applies to Chapter 6 and to another paragraph, but it does not apply to Chapter 7, where it's in the only field where it counts, when it is about decisions on coercive measures against aggressor states. And according to Chapter 7, the Council has the power and can pass resolutions which are binding on all, have legal binding effect on all member states of the United Nations, and these measures include the imposition of economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, and also the use of military force. It's all at the discretion of the Council. And if one pays attention to the, or if one is aware of the really almost absolute power which is vested in the Council. And we have seen what then that can mean, for instance, in 1991, when there was this war under United Nations auspices against Iraq. If one considers that those countries who have the maximum, the greatest military potential, they themselves can never be subjected to an enforcement action. They are even allowed to vote on issues where they themselves are the aggressor. It makes a mockery of justice, but it lets us, it makes it easier for us to understand why things have gone the way they did. Of course, one could say, and that brings me to the fourth and last point, and I don't know how, please just tell me if I'm over the time. One could say the following. Yes, there is this somehow really this special privilege for 5 countries, which was inserted into the Charter into 1945. By the way, at this time in San Francisco, in the final days before the foundings, before the states did adopt the Charter, it was, the UN was created in San Francisco, a Latin American delegate rightly said, oh, yeah, I mean, they discussed the procedures for the Security Council. He said, oh, it seems we will adopt a charter which will make it possible to condemn a mouse, but which will, where there is absolutely no possibility to act against an elephant. And that is exactly the problem. It was a capitulation before power. But the United Nations organization also, this one has to be aware of, would never have come into existence if this privilege would not have been written into the Charter. Cordell Hull, who was Foreign Secretary of the U.S., made it very clear. He also wrote about this in his memoirs. He said there should be no illusion. The U.S. would never have joined unless this provision would have been there. Yeah, so the point could be made. Yes, there is this privilege, but this is the privilege of 5 of the 5 most powerful countries, and it could also be understood as a kind of a countermeasure or as something of representing a kind of power balance. If there is indeed a kind of a constellation among 5 countries in a way that the power of one would hold the exercise of power by the others and their excesses in check, one could say, oh, maybe this is a kind of mechanism of balancing out these 5 great players, and in this sense one might accept it. But of course this rationale will be obsolete as soon as there is no power balance anymore among those 5 countries. In the meantime, several decades later, and particularly at the beginning of the 1990s, one could not rightly say that there was a balance of power among the 5 major players, which would have meant that no player would really would abuse the charter, which one might have thought could mean that each of these players would use its veto privilege in a responsible manner and so on. But that certainly, as we have seen, was not the case. And if you take, for instance, 2003, I always get back to that example. If you go back to 2003, it is so obvious. The United States, of course, they did not get endorsement for invading Iraq. There was no Security Council resolution. In earlier years, they got endorsements for resolutions because in this period, shortly after 1990, China was not yet, was just acting cautiously and did abstain, and Russia was a shadow of its former self, so to speak, and just endorsed under Yeltsin, endorsed everything what the United States wanted. But this was not the case in 2003, but anyway, the United States did not need to pay attention, did not need to be worried, because nothing could be taken against this invasion, because the United States anyway could have vetoed it. So this has meant, especially since the collapse of the earlier power balance of the Cold War, and I mean the bipolar power balance that evolved in the 50s and 60s between the United States and the Soviet Union. After the collapse of this bipolar power balance, there was really a kind of situation which one could describe with the law of the jungle. And that brings me to the last point, how to do something about this situation, or what could the re-establishment of international law mean. And I would follow here this consideration of the balance of power. There is a structural problem built into the UN Charter. One could say, oh yeah, the best would be to adapt, for instance, the list of the permanent members of the Security Council with veto privilege to the realities of today. The power constellation is different. For instance, the United Kingdom is certainly, in terms of military might and so on, also economic might, is not a global power anymore. The same one could say about France. So why should these countries separately, individually, both enjoy a privilege, which they do not, in terms of their actual power, they do not deserve anymore? So one should adapt the list, one should bring in other countries like Germany and so on. But all of this I have written in the beginning of the 90s. And I remember we had a discussion with Foreign Minister Kinkel of Germany at that time. But the problem is structural. Nothing can be changed in the Charter unless those 5 permanent countries enjoying the veto right agree. So they can veto any change, and that means there will be no change in the foreseeable future. So how to see chances, or what could then be chances for the re-establishment of international law? Of course, in terms of the statute, if there would be a possibility of change, one might say, an idea would be, and I have discussed this now since more than 20 years, I think, and it's quite frustrating in UN circles, an idea could be that permanent membership with this veto privilege should be redefined in the Charter, and it should not be related to a single country, an individual country, but to a region, if such a regional organization exists. For instance, now, Africa is totally left out of this power equation of the permanent members. There is no seat for an African country, also the same for Latin America, the same for Southeast Asia. So the idea would be, for instance, instead of Europe having 2 seats, 2 permanent seats, if one keeps the notion of permanent membership, why not should the regional organization that exists in Europe occupy that seat, and why should that not rotate among the individual member states? The same, for instance, for Africa, where you have the Organization of African Union, and so on. So that would be an idea, and that would mean much better balance, and it would also mean a much more responsible and acceptable use of the veto right, or a much better rationale for this consensus principle, which it is. But now it's just a consensus principle related to 5 specific states. If it would be a consensus principle related to the global regions, it would be something else. But secondly, what also would be necessary, and again, this will be wishful thinking, but let's just dream a little bit about how the Charter could be adapted to the requirements of law. Secondly, one would have to eliminate all the other contradictions between basic norms, all the legal contradictions in the Charter. One would have to remove that provision according to which, in decisions about war and peace, namely under Chapter 7, the obligation for a party to a conflict to abstain from voting does not apply, because that's the situation now. If a country wages war, if it's a permanent member, it is not obliged to abstain from voting. Or any country in the Security Council can vote on its own aggression. That provision should be removed, and it would be so easy. In terms of drafting, it would just be necessary to leave out, to eliminate a few words in paragraph 3 of Article 27. But anyhow, in the foreseeable future, that will not be the case. So the hope for the re-establishment of international law, as far as I see it, is can be described in a different way, in a more realistic way, and that is in view of the re-emergence of a new balance of power, which for the time being, as I said, is not incorporated or not represented in the UN Charter. We have seen the development of several regional groupings. We have seen also the development of the BRICS grouping, and these are new factors or new elements of the global power equation, which cannot be ignored any longer, and which will be will get more stronger in the near future. So that, in my view, means 2 things. First of all, the traditional great powers who enjoy these privileges in the Charter will have to be more cautious in how they use this privilege. Because even if on paper, for instance, a state like UK or France has that privilege, if vetoing a certain resolution would mean repercussions for that country in terms of its relations with continents that are important economically and so on, or with countries that are important economically, it might think twice whether it really should use that privilege or not. So it might, be less tempted just to assert its power because it has that statutory power. That is one aspect of my consideration. The other aspect is related to the larger global picture. Should, at some point in the future, the international community, which is now not really mirrored by the composition of the Security Council. Should the real international community come to the conclusion that one cannot reform the Charter of the UN, the time may come, and this would not be the first time in history, that one has to think about a new beginning, and that means just about phasing out an organization that has been that is being paralyzed, that cannot reform itself, as unfortunate as this may be, and to replace it by a new statute on which one might reach consensus at a certain stage. Unconventional measures are possible. We have seen it also in the case of how the President of the United States acts, also on issues that have been considered almost intractable a short time ago. And as far as a world organization is concerned, it would be worth considering such a new statute, which would include the global regions as major players, and which would do justice also to this principle of sovereign equality. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Köchler, for pointing out these very important sets of principles, shortcomings of the old order, the old paradigm, and the necessity to bring about a new paradigm. I'm sure we have more questions that can be asked later in the question and answer period. I would like to welcome the third speaker of this panel, Mr. Marco Zanni from Italy. He is a member of the European Parliament and is sitting within the ENF group. He is also a member of the Lega, or the League Party, has professional experience in banking, and is therefore also a representative and member of the EU Parliament's Committee on Monetary and Budgetary Affairs. He will talk about the future of the EU. Has the integration gone too far? The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and it's always a pleasure to address such an audience. It's the third time that I participate to the conference organized by the Schiller Institute, and it's a really nice experience. Today, as Stefan told, I'm here to talk about the future of the European Union, and the question that I would like to pose to the audience is a very important one. Last week, on Thursday and Friday, we had this European Council meeting that showed clearly that European countries are divided and are not more able to make progression about the future of the European Union. There is no agreement on migration, there is no agreement on the future of the Eurozone, and the only thing that they can agree is to keep the status quo and to kick the can down the street. That is becoming the main policy of the European Union. So this question is very important to address because people are getting angry with the failure of the European Union and the European institution in trying to solve the three main problems that they are facing today. The economic crisis that is still ongoing in a lot of countries, and Europe is one of the worst performers in economic growth between big countries around the world. The second problem is the internal security program. European people are getting hungry about the lack of security that we are experiencing in our cities all around Europe. And the third big problem is the management of migration flows. The impact of uncontrolled migration flows to Europe has been very strong in the past years, and the ineffectiveness of the European Union in addressing this problem and in helping African or Middle East countries in solving their problems, so creating the conditions for those people traveling or trying to reaching the European Union for staying at their home with good opportunities there, failed. In this point, and addressing this point, the European Union is trying to send a lot of money to those countries through what we call it the Juncker Plan for Africa. It's a sort of financial engineering plan with a small amount of fresh money and a lot of financial engineering with fake money marketed around by the European Commission. But on this point, the European Union has to look at what Chinese are doing in Africa and in developing countries, because sending this money has been really ineffective for the European Union. We have not been able to create development in those countries. We have not been able to have value for money in the aid that we sent to African countries. And the Chinese model is very effective in its operation, because all the flow of money that Chinese send to African countries, to Eastern Africa, to the Middle East, also to the Balkans, they are strictly controlled by the government, and the results and the value that this money created is strongly controlled by the government with a centralized strategy. The European Union is delegating the management of the foreign aids to African countries to private companies. So we don't have control on the money that we send to Africa. We don't have the tools to control the effectiveness and the results in terms of growth, employment, and creating value for that countries using money of European taxpayers. So our policies in helping those countries is really ineffective. So we should, like on this point, we should look at the Chinese model in order to eradicate at the start the problem of migration flows. On the economic crisis, it's pretty clear that the policies that the European institutions pursued in the last 7 years, so from the starting of the Eurozone crisis in 2010, have been ineffective in restoring growth, employment in the euro area and in the whole European Union. And those mistakes created not only macroeconomic imbalances in the European Union, but they created strong divergence and balkanization of the European Union member states. And what happened last week at the European Council, freezing all the discussion about the future of the European Union because there is no agreement and there's lack of trust between the European countries, is the sign that we have to think or rethink about the cooperation between European countries, because it's pretty clear to everyone, not only in the European Union, but also outside the European Union, and I will talk later about the approach of the new U.S. administration to the Europe. It's pretty clear that Europe is divided, that Europe cannot go on with forced integration that is refused by European people. So that's the main question of my speech. Has the integration gone too far? And my reply and my thought about this question is yes, but this forced integration is disintegrating Europe, the European values, the European economy, and Europe as one of the most important contributors to the growth of the world economy and the civilization in the past centuries. So the big questions that European leaders have to give an answer is, are we able to rethink and create a different institutional framework based on different values that could restore prosperity, cooperation, and solidarity in Europe? That's the big question. So it's clear that the actual institutional framework, really centralized in Brussels and in the European Union institutions, the Commission especially, is not working in addressing the problems that the European citizens are living. It's clear that this fragmented and this fragmentation and the balkanization of the interests in the European Union are creating a huge problem in the stability not only of countries that are still affected by the economic crisis, the so-called PIGS, but in the whole European Union, also in the countries that are considered positive examples and the winners of the European integration. And the reference to Germany is a very strong one. It's very actual talking about Germany vis-à-vis what is happening and the lack of legitimation that the European Union and the European Union institutions are living today. Because the Chancellor of Germany has been for years the symbol of the unity and the values of the European Union, and as one of the stronger leader in the European member states. And the results or the difficulties that today the Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, is living is the result of the wrong policies that she backed and she pursued at the European Union level. Not only on the migration, that probably today is the main issue debated in Germany, but also on fostering and feeding a wrong economic model on which the Eurozone is based. And this economic model is really fragile and is not sustainable. Why? Because it's too dependent on external factors. Our economy in the Eurozone is based on reducing internal costs, so inflation and labor costs, to export our products outside the European Union, outside the Eurozone. So to pursue large external surplus in order to feed the economy at home. But this strategy is falling apart today because it's too dependent on the possibility that external or third countries outside the Eurozone will accept to absorb such a huge external surplus. And this is what is happening not only with the Trump administration, but with the United States, because since the Obama administration, the U.S. started to questioning the large external surpluses of the Eurozone and of Germany. So the economic model on which the Eurozone is based is too dependent on the decisions of third countries or of governments that you cannot control, and is clearly not sustainable. What about security? Another very important point and problem that we are living in the European Union. Also, on this point, the European Union is too dependent from the decision of third countries. The NATO, the North Atlantic Alliance, is led by the U.S. in terms of investment in military capacity and in security. And the European Union is not able and has not been able to build up a common military capacity or to give its share of defense to the North Atlantic alliances. And for the military defense, we are still too dependent on the United States, so on a third country, on a government that we cannot control. And on the management of migration flows, we are still too dependent on the decisions and the ability to make good agreements with countries in Africa, in the Middle East, investing there. So it's clear that the strategy that the European leaders pursued in the last 7 years has been failure, total failure in addressing the three main issues, because we are too dependent on external decisions. And this situation should end very soon, because the political unsustainability of the framework on which the development of the European Union is based is totally wrong. And we have to change such a framework, looking at a cooperation that will not look only at the actual composition of the European Union, so the 27 member states that from March 2019 will be part of the European Union, but an alternative framework that could bring the European Union to positive track of growth, regaining also the geopolitical importance that Europe had in the past, should include sort of role of the European Union and Europe as a bridge between the U.S., so the traditional international power that shaped all the international institutions in the 20th century, and the rising powers on the eastern side of the globe. China, Russia for the energy supply, another point on which the European Union is really dependent from the decision of people outside the Union, and regaining this role as a connector between the new rising powers at East and the new approach that the Trump administration is having in international relations. And the fact that thanks to the approach that Mr. Trump had in the last G7 with the new Italian Prime Minister, Italy is also regained a geopolitical importance in the international debate. A lot of people before the European Council and the international meetings that the new Italian Prime Minister attended in the past weeks say that due to the radical approach of the new Italian government, Italy would have been isolated by the other countries. But the reality is that thanks to the support of the U.S., to the openness of the U.S., also to the attempt to create strong relationship also with China, we have our Undersecretary to the Commerce that has a strong experience in China and in Chinese relationship. Italy is regaining geopolitical importance in shaping the future of Europe. We need a new institutional framework that will shape a new era for Europe, a new era that is no more based on centralization, on decisions taken by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels and in the European Central Bank. But we need a new institutional framework that is respectfful of the differences that the 27 member states of the European Union have. And it's not only, they are not only differences in the way in which we see and we look at the economy and the economic development, but it's also a difference in the political system, in the cultural systems that we have at the European Union level and in the member states. So the new institutional framework, if Europe would like to survive to this crisis, should be based on more subsidiarity. So we should question ourselves, asking what is the common ground that we have today in the European Union and Europe? What are the common things that we can pursue for the common benefit and the mutual benefit of the European countries? And on the other side, what are the things and the topics in which the difference is too wide, in which the divergence is too big, and in which it's impossible to find a common ground and an agreement that can satisfy all the European countries? So with more subsidiarity, so returning some competencies and powers to the national capitals, Europe can survive and can regain a path of growth and regain its role at the center of the geopolitical debate as a connector between the new U.S. approach to the international institutions and the rising powers in Asia and the Middle East. And the work that the Italian government is trying to do in shaping this new institutional framework will be very important to give an example to other European countries that want to pursue the same way. The 2019, and let me conclude with this view on what could happen after 2019. 2019 will be a very important year for the future of Europe and the European Union. In May, we will have new elections in the European Parliament. So the European Parliament Assembly will be renewed. And as you may know, the European Union institutions are mainly three: the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the Commission, and on the other side, the Parliament. So we have member states, we have the Commission that should be a sort of executive, and we have the Parliament. Today, the European Council has changed its view on the future of the European Union. With the Italian government, with the new Austrian government, with other governments with new party joining the European Council, the approach on the future of the European Union will be more based on subsidiarity, on the defense of the interests of European people, and on finding common ground on things that we can do better together. But after 2019, we will have another institution, the European Parliament, that will foster the change in European politics. We will have three big political families probably in the next European Parliament. From the one side, traditional parties that are falling apart in terms of consensus and voters, with the socialists that will disappear probably. On the center, we will have these, let me say, these fake puppets called Macron, that is supposed to be the new leader of the European integration, the new leader that will bring Europe to the United States of Europe, but is simply falling apart with strong difficulties in France and no support for his proposal of reforming the European Union in the Council. And on the other side, we will have a stronger group, even stronger than today, of the so-called Eurosceptic or Eurocritics that will shape strongly the politics of the European Parliament. If Europe wants to be saved, then we have to change radically our institutional framework without no more centralization in Brussels, without no more decisions and economic systems focused on the needs of the big banks and the city of London, but a cooperative system that is respectful of the differences of the national states, of the spaces of democracies, and of the decisions and willingness of European people. European people does want to have the United States of Europe. They want just equal cooperation between European nations and sovereign states in order to bring more prosperity to Europe and to the world, and in order to solve the three main problems that they are experiencing today, and I mentioned it before in my speech. So my hope is that in the near future, other governments will join the new Italian government in this effort to reform Europe in a more equal, stable, and solid institutions. Without this reform that we strongly need, the European Union is condemned to falling and to creating a huge crisis, geopolitical crisis at the heart of the world. So let me conclude saying that our Europe will reform in that sense, or the European Union will be finished and European countries will be affected by a crisis, a new crisis that will be stronger than the one that we experienced after 2010. Our system is dysfunctional, our system is unequal and is fostering divergences and imbalances inside Europe. We have to change it. My hope is that we will be able to do it very quickly. If not, the European Union will finish very soon in a disorderly way, creating huge suffers for European people. But I'm confident that new politicians and new parties rising all around Europe will be able to do it as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. If those guests among you who witness these proceedings for maybe the very first time and have not yet declared membership, please do so now. If you are gripped by the urgency of that we are brought to the verge of disintegration, chaos, by failed policies that have to be replaced by a new set of principles, then regard, please, not only your membership in the Schiller Institute, but also an active participation. I think my colleagues at the book table will attend to your needs. I would like to introduce the fourth speaker, Mr. Dr. Armin Azima. He has started his career in the field of laser-driven nuclear fusion science and has graduated on this topic with a diploma in 2003. But lack of funding had him change his field of research to free electron laser science, where he achieved his doctoral degree in the year of 2007, and he has since been working at the University of Hamburg. Because of his private passion, his never-ending passion for fusion research, he did work on alternative fusion concepts, such as the fusor, parallel to his main occupation. And Dr. Azima is now giving us his presentation. It's called The Controllable Energy.
Good. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, dear conference board, dear Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Mr. Linden-LaRouche, thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. It is an honor for me to be here, and I believe that I will convince the audience that physics in our modern world is very exciting. Promising developments are currently ongoing, from which you maybe even haven't heard so far. Thus, please allow me to inform you and simultaneously entertain you by the marvelous, this was too fast, by the marvelous progress in the field of energy technology which can be witnessed by us today in the world. In this talk, I will concentrate on the following topics. I will provide you with some interesting numbers about the German energy transition process and what it practically means for the people in Germany. Then I will focus on two hotspots of nuclear science in the world which are very promising. Especially the mastering of the fusion technology will open up the gate to a new, wonderful world with possibilities which are currently unthinkable. Thus, finally, I would like to present you some ideas what could be done if power were cheap. But before I begin with the technological part, I would like to remember to LaRouche's 4 laws that are the reconstitution of the Glass-Steagall Act and the introduction of a national banking system. As third point, the continuous increase of the general flux density in society in general. This includes the further development of civil infrastructure to be capable to make use of future powerful energy sources and to further increase the physical economic output and the human population density. And fourth, a topic which is important for me personally as being a physicist, that is the research on the utilization of nuclear fusion as ultimate energy source. To my personal belief, this is the only possibility to maintain a high level of prosperity in a growing world for all mankind in the future. In that sense, the third and the fourth law support each other. But let me at first start with one of the major aspects in LaRouche's fourth law, that is the concept of increasing the energy flux density, which shall now be abbreviated with the letter phi. In this sketch, I have plotted examples of phi collected by me for various energy sources like wind power, carbon-related energy sources, and nuclear power. And you can directly observe that nuclear power has a many tenfold higher energy flux density than any other conventional power source. In this context, I want to cite a curious statement which was published by our daily news program Tagesschau.de. The wind engine park, which can replace one nuclear power plant, would consume the area of the federal state of Bremen. As a consequence of the well-known energy transition to regenerative energy sources in Germany, I would like to show you this map in which all the installed wind engines in Germany are plotted as small brown spots. Together, they all generated about the same amount of power as the 7 red spots representing the nuclear power plants in the year 2016. I think this sketch makes the concept of energy flux density really sculptural. And as you know, those red spots will disappear in the year 2022, at that time when our national exit plan from nuclear power will be fulfilled. Of course, one easily understands that the widespreading of power engines, which we call decentralization of energy production in Germany, requires a complex and expensive power transport network. especially as compared to that time when the power mix was dominated by a few powerful central power engines about 20 years ago. And as expected, the energy costs have risen and still will rise in the next future. Currently, we have fulfilled a transition to about 30% of regenerative energy sources in our energy mix, and the electricity price has increased by more than 50% inflation adjusted. And the goal shall be to reach 80% in the year 2050. The German federal government, however, claims that electricity prices will decrease after 2025 again, which I would add the word maybe to. We will see. Here I have calculated the final electricity bill for Germany and compared it to France, which has more than 50% of nuclear power in their electricity mix. Sure, Germany is a wealthy country and many people can tolerate the higher energy prices, but not all. And for a comparable large and comparable densely populated developing country, a power bill of larger than 150 billion euro per year would be definitely too high. Hence, the French energy mix might be better suiting to their needs, to put it in diplomatic words. Please note that I have disregarded the price advance as a subsidy for industry in Germany. But let's concentrate on nuclear power in detail. As we have learned, the energy flux density of nuclear fission power currently is the highest technologically available under all power sources today. But despite of that fact, the German federal government has decided to fully exit nuclear power technology in Germany by the year 2022. And the question is why? From a rational standpoint, only the following criticisms could have been the reason, that are the problem of nuclear waste disposal, the reactor safety, and the prevention of proliferation of nuclear weapons technology. Due to limited time, I will concentrate only on the first bullet point for now. But at first, some fast basics on nuclear power. Our general nuclear reactors are light water reactors which work with thermal, hence slow neutrons. The chain reaction then improves greatly since the slow neutrons interact with the fuel much more efficiently. However, this has a price, namely, these neutrons lose the ability to crack isotopes of even mass number, which significantly decreases the variety of working different fuel materials of this kind of reactors. In this sketch, you can see what a typical nuclear fuel rod is composed of. The natural uranium consists mainly out of isotope 238 with even mass number, which cannot be burned by the thermal neutrons. Hence, one artificially enriches the isotope 235 of odd mass number before it goes to the reactor. After 3 years of operation, most of the 235 is burned, while the amount of 238 is almost the same as before. But new materials have been breeded, like plutonium and other minor actinoids, which we refer to as nuclear waste. In this sketch, you can see In this diagram, you can see a life cycle of a fuel rod. The natural uranium becomes enriched, burned, the waste is separated, and finally disposed, and part of the fuel rod becomes recycled and is reused again. The problem, the final repository must safely contain the waste for over 300,000 years, which is not yet manageable up to now. And thus, Russia has chosen another way. Since 2016, a new reactor type named BN800, the BN stands for Bystrych Neutronov, which means fast neutrons, has been taken into operation. This reactor is called a fast burner, which is closely related to a fast breeder. It uses now fast neutrons, and thus their neutrons can burn now all heavy isotopes, including those with even mass number, and this even with high efficiency. And that's the trick. This reactor is now capable to reuse its waste components as new fuel in a long cycle over and over again. The chain ends in either a stable or only a quickly decaying element which can be safely taken out of the depository already after 100 years instead of 300,000 years. Thus, this reactor does not need a final repository any longer. The BN800 is a fast, high-temperature reactor using molten natrium as coolant for the experts in the plenum. Please refer to this link for further infos about this reactor technology. To make it clear, the BN800 can burn nuclear waste as if it were conventional nuclear fuel. No final depository is needed for the end products of this reactor, and this reactor runs now in this very moment. Consequently, this means that this reactor has de-defined the word nuclear waste, because what shall be the waste now? Actually, it is exactly as Lyndon LaRouche has predicted about 10 years ago. He said already at that time, there exists no nuclear waste, only we currently do not have the technology to make use of the end products. But now we have. In this inlay, you see a small picture of this BN800 reactor, and there's written some nice words. In Germany, wer etwas will, findet Wege, wer etwas nicht will, findet Gründe. Who does want something, finds solution. Who does not want who wants to prevent something, finds reasons. So, I deleted this bullet point from the list of criticisms. Problem solved. Now let's quickly move to another hot technology. I would like to show you recent news on fusion research. Let me introduce you a company called 3-alpha Energy from California. The mission of this company is to master a special form of nuclear fusion, which is vastly unknown. That is the proton-boron 11 reaction, PB11 reaction. The special feature here is the aneutronic character of the end products. Classical fusion devices, like the tokamak ITER, typically generate neutrons as end products, which carries most of the usable power. But those little fellows are hard to be transformed into electricity, as they are electrically neutral and thus permeate all matter easily. But before it becomes too complex, let me represent you a small drawings which quickly shows the reactor principle. In the upper drawing, you see an overview of the 3-alpha reactor. From left and right, 2 rings of hot plasma are fired to collide in the center with 250 kilometers per second. In the collision point, the 2 rings merge and form a donut-shaped plasma sphere which can stabilize and contain itself. The record of this machine was to keep the plasma stable for more than 10 milliseconds. And recently, they have also shown that they can reach high temperatures of up to 20 million degrees Celsius, which both are milestones for this project. And of course, there's still a long way to go to reach finally 3 billion degrees Celsius for 1 second, that is 1000 milliseconds, which is roughly needed for net energy output. But as the end products of this reaction are positively charged, the conversion of the released fusion energy to electricity works with over 90% efficiency directly. No turbines, no steam production is required for this kind of reactor. Therefore, it will have the size of a truck and can generate 100 megawatt of clean, safe, and in principle unlimited amount of energy, of electricity. And of course, such a device lets one dream on future machines, as for example, Robert Buzard and others proposed here. The direct nuclear to electricity conversion with extremely high energy flux density allows to empower an ion propulsion engine which accelerates in a continuous acceleration and deceleration process of plus minus 1 g, perfectly for a human body, a rocket to a few % of light speed. This would reduce the travel time between Earth and Mars to about 2 weeks, and the inner planets would become reachable. And this brings me directly to more ideas of what would be possible if power were extremely cheap. We could think of desalination of seawater on a large scale, or artificial petroleum means oil synthesis. Or my favorite, a revolutionary waste recycling system which not only burns waste to gas, but instead uses even more power to transfer the waste into a plasma state. This is a very energy-consuming process, but possible by using the arc plasma technology. It would give us the possibility to crack down any material, any type of waste, to its molecules or even atoms, which could then be resorted and element-wise extracted out of the waste, which is to say 100% recycling. Finally, all this means the end of hunger and thirst for all of us. Last but not least, please let me remind you again to Laroux's last two laws. Keeping in mind of what I presented before, I think these demands are neither abstract nor unrealistic. Instead, reaching these goals would make our world better in all aspects, why we should keep working to realize them. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you. Is this working? Thank you very much, Dr. Azima, for bringing us the new paradigm in form of unlimited power and energy resources to this room. I was told that there was potentially an intervention or a little presentation by Jochen Heibertshausen, the conductor of yesterday's concert. Is that true, or is that cancelled? Essentially. Okay, thank you. Helga, do you have anything else from this other document that we have? No. Okay. Well, then we have 30 minutes of question and answers, and I would then ask our colleague Stefan Tolksdorf to go around with a microphone. The four panelists are ready. Please, when asking the question, say your name, organization, or affiliation, and be as concise as short as possible. So I think the first question goes to, okay, we have Hussein Askari.
Yeah, hi. I have a comment. It's not directed against what Marco Zanni said. I really appreciate your passion and your great work you are doing. My comment is provoked by one aspect you mentioned in your presentation. I have no doubt about your sincerity and honesty in your work. This was the point where when people say we are sending money to Africa and the Middle East, and the effect of sending money to Africa and the Middle East has been a corrupting effect for many years. And in the case of the Middle East, a lot of the money which was sent, and I know this from Sweden, ended up in groups supporting jihadi terrorists, like the White Helmets and so on. So please don't send money to Africa or to the Middle East. What is the effect of, the other thing which this creates in the mind of people is that African nations or Middle East nations, they are not equal nations to the Europeans. They are beggars standing with their hats outside the door of the European Union asking for charity. That's a very terrible image of Africa and Middle East nations. What needs to be done is, an example is also from what China is doing. China is not sending money to anyone in Africa for these projects. As I said in the example of the Yemeni port project, the money does not go to the Yemeni government. The Yemeni government gets a piece of paper from China Export Bank to the Central Bank of Yemen saying, you owe us $500 million for building this port. You can pay it in 50 years, but we are not in a hurry. You can start paying in 15 years when your economy starts growing. The money, the so-called money, goes to the Chinese company which will build the project, because they need to buy material, they need to employ people, and so on and so forth. So one example for Italy, for example, if the Italian Export-Import Bank or other institution finances Bonifica, together with the Chinese, the Bonifica company, to build the Transaqua project or other projects in Africa, whereby the money from the Italian taxpayers will go to an Italian company. It does not go to the government of Congo or anybody else. So in that sense, what this creates, this new paradigm of relations among nations will be characterized by what we call the credit system. which means that you don't help Africa. What you do, you empower Africa by giving African nations the tools they need to become equals in trade and economic cooperation with Europe. What this also, this statement that we give money to Africans, this also feeds this, the populist notions, is that most of the problems in Europe are generated by African countries or the refugees, you know, this whole discussion about the refugees, that you create scapegoats for the faults of the policymakers of the African Union or of the African government. And this, we have to admit that there's a huge problem with the xenophobia in Europe, and this kind of discussion just provokes that and give it nutrition. What is needed, and I really appreciate the work you are doing, is that the frustration among forces like your party and others should be turned into a creative energy, a positive energy to create this effect, a change in the paradigm, how Europe deals with the rest of the world, how to work on the Belt and Road in Africa and in other countries. So that would have a huge impact if you turn that energy into a positive work. And the Schiller Institute are very open, and myself personally, and I believe Helge and the other members of the Schiller Institute don't object if we help the European Union or the leaders of the European Union and educate them on this new paradigm and the methods that are necessary. Thank you.
Yeah, we should give him time to respond. Is the microphone on?
No.
Yes, it should be on. Yes.
Oh, okay. Just a quick reply. That is exactly the point that I tried to highlight in my speech. The money that the European countries are using or supposed to use for Africa are not helping and are not supporting growth and are not supporting African countries in empowering their governments and their people in creating development, growth, and job. And as you correctly said, too many times this money are supporting and financing illegal and criminal activities. So we have to change the way in which we use money to support third countries. And I mentioned the Chinese example because it's this example, I'm not talking about the goals or whatever. I'm talking about a way in which the Chinese government and Chinese institutions use and manage the money that they invest in third countries. Europe has to look at this model if we want to be effective and not only wasting European taxpayers' money, but also creating difficulties with this money in the countries in which we try to invest it and send it. You mentioned the Transaqua project and the Bonifica, the Italian company that was part of the, that is part of this project. This is one little step in this direction. So the European Union is taking another route with this Juncker plan for Africa that is exactly the opposite of this. We are giving money to private institutions that are not investing in projects, in infrastructures that could empower African countries, but are just wasting money or financing smugglers, illegal activities and criminal activities. So I hope that European institutions will cooperate, will look at the Chinese model in order to be more effective in using the money to empower African countries and to create the opportunities for African people to develop and to create growth and jobs.
Just one point of order. There's a line of people that has already formed to ask questions, but there are already other hands going. Oh, you want to respond? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes.
just a short comment. The problem of Europe, it has endorsed British monetarism, the cult of money. And this cult of money creates a cult of corruption, and people got corrupted. Once Houphouët-Boigny, the leader of the Ivory Coast, said, of course I am corrupt, in a television program, but to be corrupt, you need people to corrupt you, so blame the corruptors, and look who they are. So it's clearly understood, and China developed itself not on the basis of money, it developed on the basis of a true understanding of what economics are. Economics are the promotion and the development of the creative powers of human beings. And for that, you need education, you need training, you need great jobs, and you need a great design where everybody believes that the future will be better than the past. And this is what Europe has not provided to the world, and we should work with China to provide that to the world without, let's say, falling into the trap of anti-Americanism, which will be another type of disaster. So it should be a connection between Asia, Europe, the United States, and the whole world. And that, here in the Schiller Institute, is our great design of the world Landbridge. And if Europe doesn't go in that direction, either it would lead to a catastrophe or Europe would be left aside of the world to come.
Dr. Köchler, you've been involved in the fight for a long time with your organization. And I can also remember your support for Mr. LaRouche when he was imprisoned. And your idea, if an institution cannot be reformed, then it should just be disbanded. I think that's a good idea. I have a question on the International Court. We have one in Europe. And I would like to know what your opinion of the International Court is. There are some countries who don't have a very high opinion of it, including Serbia and other countries. And I would like to know your opinion and if you think that would be a workable institution for international justice.
You asked about an international court at the regional level in Europe. I do not mean which one you referred to. There is the Europe, yeah, because there are so many courts. There is the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which I mentioned. And did you mean this one? Oh yeah, I mean it's located in Europe, but it's not a European court. My position is quite skeptical as far as the idea of justice is concerned. I have recently written about this in the Chinese Journal of International Law, and my concern can be expressed in the question whether this court should not better be called a regional court for Africa. I mean, the problem is the politicization. If you have a body that has the authority to prosecute international crimes, and those are war crimes, the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, if you have such a body with that jurisdiction, but without the membership of the most powerful countries, and exactly those countries that have the capacity to commit, whose leaders have the capacity to commit those crimes. I mean, the leaders, let's say, of San Marino or Liechtenstein, they will even not be tempted to to order the commission of international crimes because the capacities are not there. But the great military powers, they are all not members of the court. So that's the problem. The court cannot take any action. And by the way, recently, the court has also got jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. It sounds beautiful, but again, one has to read the fine print. The court can only exercise jurisdiction in a kind of dependence of the Security Council. So what's the point if the Security Council first has to determine that an aggression occurred, if only then the court can exercise jurisdiction, because that means to inject politics right into the court's exercise of justice. Why would, an aggressor state, if this would be one of the 5 great powers, could always prevent the International Criminal Court from prosecuting such cases. And the other thing is the empirical record. This court has now existed since 2002. That means a little over 15 years. What is its record? It has prosecuted almost, it has finished almost no case, and almost all the cases under prosecution or investigation are related to countries in Africa. One has to question why. Why has the court not prosecuted, for instance, the situation in Afghanistan yet? I mean, now timidly the prosecutor is taking up an investigation. Why has the court found that it is not necessary to investigate the behavior, for instance, in Iraq of soldiers and commanders of a country that was part of the coalition and where they would have jurisdiction, I mean the United Kingdom? They just did not take up this. So the problem is this court is, first of all, not universal. It would need to be universal in order to deserve the name international, because if you cannot prosecute the leaders of the most powerful countries, you have to forget about justice. And secondly, it has used its limited jurisdiction also in a very selective and politically expeditious manner. That is my comment.
I want to expand the podium for a few minutes to give the microphone to Ms. Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And afterwards, we have 6 more questions. We should then end it because, we don't have enough time. 5 or 6?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Professor Köchler for your really brilliant presentation, which I think is urgent that this is being discussed. I have the following things I would like you to comment on. In the past, we already discussed in the Schiller Institute the reasons why the UN Charter does not, even so it's an excellent outgrowth of the Peace of Westphalia, and it is the best international law establishment so far, but it did not function in our view because it lacks what I would call an ontological dimension, because you would want to ground it to principles which are more deeply embodied with the human species and our role, I would even say our role in the universe. So the new statutes, which have, in my view, have to be discussed and defined because the old one does not function, has to be in line with the spirit of the new Silk Road, or what some people call the Silk Road Dharma. In India, people call it the Silk Road Dharma, which is the idea that you have to have principles which reflect what in India they call the cosmological order, which has to define the laws on Earth. You find the same idea in almost every major culture, that legitimacy of the governing only is derived from being in cohesion with the laws of the universe, or the order of creation, or however you will call it. So I think that there is also a lot of discussion about new global governance, that the old governance does not function for the reasons or similar reasons as you discussed it. So I think that we need to have a discussion how to define such higher principles, because it's not a question of legality or legitimacy, it's a question of, how do you give mankind an order of continuous self-governance which is in cohesion with the dignity and creativity of the human species. And I think that this is very much worth of some serious dialogue, because you want to consider the views of all of the major civilizations of this planet. So I would like you to comment on this.
I agree with you that there should be such a greater, if I may call it, philosophical outlook in drafting a charter for a global and universal system. I think traces of that idea, which you have now explained to us, can be found in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is this idea that every human being has rights that are part of, that are naturally his or her rights, and that this is something which is common, or that is something which unites people of all races and ethnicities and belief systems. Because the major challenge now is how to draft a charter that is not one-sided in the direction, for instance, of a certain ideological or even religious position, and that emphasizes the common heritage of mankind. And I would say, if a new charter would be drafted, that, and if one would try in the drafting to bring it in conformity with these ideals, which are expressed in the Declaration of Human Rights. By the way, the Declaration of Human Rights is not legally binding. This is a declaration of principles. It is not international law in the strict sense, but it could be a kind of guideline in the direction which you have worked out. And I can not more agree also to what you said about the universal mission of mankind. I think also that aspect of the great common challenge which we face in expanding our existence to the outer space, to the planetary system. That is also something which could be, if we realize it in the proper form, this could be one of the factors of global peace. And it could, if all those energies which mankind so far has mobilized to destroy and to wage wars against one people or one nation against the other, if all that energy would be invested in the joint great purpose of reaching a higher stage by also being able to expand our space, our living space beyond that Earth, which will not anyway indefinitely be existing, that would be something which a new world organization should also incorporate and support.
Professor Schlüter, I have a rhetoric question from a physicist. What is the human charter of which laws is the human charter of laws derived of? To my understanding, the only absolute measure of truth that we have on Earth as humans are the physical laws. There's no other way to find out what is where you see what is really true than the laws of nature and the physical laws. So why couldn't we take then the physical laws as a basic foundation?
There is, of course, one one theoretical or philosophical point which has been discussed over a very long period of time. The question is how to deduct normative conclusions from the laws of physics. Of course, the laws of physics, those are universal, and scientific procedure means that one is trying to find out the structure of those laws, and those are valid irrespective of my religious belief, of my cultural values, or whatever, or my emotions and so on. That is the idea of a scientific objectivity, which I totally describe to. And for me also the notion of there is no relativity in the notion of truth, as has been discussed in the so-called postmodernist talks. The truth means a correspondence to the reality, and that is the physical reality. But the question is, as far as international organization is concerned, or the state, the question is also about the norms that will regulate the interaction of the human beings. And the question is, can we derive those directly from statements about facts? Or more generally, how can a normative sentence be derived from a set of descriptive sentences? And here I think one should, the only way to address, to set up or to come up with a system of norms, the only way is that we have to try to reach a consensus among people with different cultural backgrounds on some of the meta norms that guide our behavior. We cannot agree on norms that are linked to very specific cultural traditions, but we can agree on more general norms, and that is what the Universal Declarations of Human Rights tried to do, and that's why they did not inject into this any teachings of particular religions and so on. And so, in spite of the objectivity and universality of the laws of nature, still, or this universality notwithstanding, we still have to negotiate among ourselves and to try to define those general norms of behavior. And they may be they will be compatible with different religious traditions, but they have to be drafted in a way that is universal, and that includes all specific traditions.
I'm sorry, I don't want to hijack this discussion, but I feel very strongly I have to respond to Armin. I think that the physical laws of the universe, there is no better analyst of that than my husband, who's sitting here besides me, because he has developed the idea of the lawfulness of the universe being an anti-entropic developing process, with the principle of creativity, of human creativity, being the most advanced aspect of that universe. So he has said, for example, when man is inventing or discovering new scientific universal principles, the universe obeys to the creativity of man, which shows, this is another idea by Vladimir Vernadsky, that human creativity becomes a geological force, power in the universe. And these are ideas which are not specific to individual discoveries, but they represent a continuous ability of the human mind to advance the processes in the universe and increase the power of the human mind over the universe. Anyway, there's a lot more in Lin's writings to be found about that. And I think I just would like to add that also we should not forget the great classical art, because Lin has always made the point that that faculty of the human mind which makes scientific discovery is also the same one like you have in great classical composition. And this is actually the same. This is also what Schiller says in the aesthetical letters, that the future will be determined by the scientists and the artists, because these are the only two people or two categories of people who have provable scientific proof. You can prove a principle of a composition and you can prove a principle of science, and that has to guide this, or that should be part of this discussion. But I want to give tribute to my husband, because I think we should consider his extremely important life work in this matter.
Hello, Eric Ruffet. My question is for Mr. Zanni. It's, do you think that the biggest problem of new controlled fusion nuclear is it's the influence, the strongly influence of the lobby, private lobby, on the politics, on the parliament, on French, on the European Commission, on the French government, because all the private company who have a nuclear central, who have eolian or all of this, don't want this kind of technology. And do you have some ways to improve this problem? Not stop, because the lobby is not all bad, but it's only for the private company. It's not come from the country and the people.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. I will try to give a quick answer. Clearly, the power of lobbyists in influencing the European institution, and especially the Commission, is very strong. We have more than 20,000 registered lobbies in the Register of Transparency, but much more are not registered, and they act through consultancy companies, so they are hindered behind consultancy companies. So what is the solution? I would like to say you just one thing. For lobbyists, it's very easy and cheaper to lobby and to influence just one institution than try to lobby 28 or more governments or institutions. So the solution in counteracting the actions of negative lobbying is less centralization in Brussels, is less centralization in the hands of the European Commission that is not fully democratic accountable to European citizens. So it's very easy for lobbyists to influence and to shape European legislation just acting on one institution. So this is the solution. Empowering, give more empowerment to the government, so it will be harder for lobbyists to influence 28 different equal institutions rather than influencing the European Commission that is not fully democratically accountable and is not fully under the control also of the Parliament, that is the only directly elected institution in the European Union.
My name is Hannelore Fackler. I have a question to Mr. Zanni. Unfortunately, I'm going to speak in German, as my English isn't good enough. Italy has now a new government, of which it is hoped that they are going to go a different path. Greece elected a few years ago a left government, but Mr. Tsipras was forced by IMF and Brussels to not govern in the interest of the population, but to again only protect the upper finance. In the case of Italy, we hope that they will go a different direction in financing and economic policy, different than what Brussels want. My question is, Is Italy strong enough to push this through? The new government also tries to introduce Glass-Steagall and not to again be under the dictate of IMF and Mr. Draghi.
Yes, this new Italian government has been agreed because you know better than me the difficulties in the negotiation of this strange yellow and green coalition that now is leading Italy. This new government has been formed with one principal goal: to avoid another technocratic government in Italy, led by another Mr. Monti, that now is called Mr. Cottarelli, that would have bring the Troika to Italy. So that's the first goal of this government. We don't want the Troika, we don't want the IMF and other unelected bureaucrats to influence governments and to revert democratic decisions taken by people. You mentioned the case of Greece, that is and should be case study that we have to assess when we talk about the history of the Eurozone and the European Union. But think about Greece at that time and think about Italy. Italy is not Greece. Italy is one of the founding members of what is now called the European Union. Italy is the third economy of the European Union, will be the third after Brexit in 2019. And Italy is too big to fail and too big to be blackmailed. If we are strong, as you correctly said, if we have especially a banking system that is resilient and is, let's say, bulletproof on the attacks that the European Commission and the ECB could bring to our system. The Italian Prime Minister, the new Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Conte, in his first speech addressing the Italian Parliament, said that talking about banking reform, talking about the future of the Italian banking system, the banking separation will be one of the main points, one of the main policy that the new Italian government will pursue. And the first step in this direction is reverting the reform of the cooperative banks that the European Central Bank imposed to the previous government. What is this commercial banking reform about? The ECB doesn't want Italy to have small regional and local banks focused on the real economy, on supporting the real economy. They are saying that they don't want those banks. They just want big and huge international banking groups focused on finance. The government is working, the new government is working in stopping this disruptive reform that will lead Italy and the European Union to another financial crisis, making disappear hundreds of small cooperative banks that now are the only ones in the Italian territory to finance and support the real economy. And they want just big merger, as the talkings about new merger between the UniCredit, the big Italian financial institution and one of the biggest in Europe, and Société Générale, one of the biggest banking French group. The European Central Bank and the European regulators are pushing in this direction, but the Italian government said no to this view. We are protecting our banking system, and we will show how one of the most important countries in Europe could be strong in saying no to the business as usual that the European institution fostered in the past years, and how this government will be able to shape and to bring Europe in a more sustainable direction in finance, in banking, and also and especially in the economic model on which Europe and European countries should be based. So Glass-Steagall and banking separation, that's not the words of Marco Zanni, but is promised by the Italian Prime Minister. Banking separation will be one of the main policies pursued by this new government. And I have been contacted by, we were talking about lobbying, and I have been contacted after the speech of Mr. Conte talking about banking separation. I have been contacted by lobbyists from big banks, Italian banks, asking to not pursue this policy. And I say this is the willingness of Italian people. So we will go directly to this point. I mean, you don't have to be worried. We are just doing it to support the growth and the stability of the banking system. And if country has a stable and prosperous banking system, then also the banking system itself will benefit. So it's for the benefit of the people, but it's also for the benefit and the growth of our banking system. So this will be policy, one of the main policy in finance that this government will pursue. But we need also the support of our other member states inside the council to make this policy not only an Italian goal, but a European goal to strengthen the stability of our financial system. Banking separation at the European level would be very important. And we will work, the Italian government will work to do this at the European level.
So we have three. Can the questions be short and maybe also the answers, because we're now kind of cutting into the lunch break.
My name is Monika Petruschek. I'm from South Germany. My question is to the man from Italy. What do you think of the line by the alternative media when they talk about the migration weapon? And my second question, I have a strong agricultural background. Who is making sure that China doesn't introduce a wrong agricultural policy into the African nations? That's very important to me, that the wrong policy from Europe and the poisoning of food won't be integrated into African nations.
So on agriculture, the point that you mentioned with experience, because you work, as I understand, in the agricultural sector, this is one of the main industry on which Europe should be focused in protecting its farmers. Today has been very difficult to protect our farmers because of sometimes unfair competition from outside the European Union. And in this sector, Italy has a huge problem because we have a lot of products, the so-called made in this industry, and the European Union institutions failed in protecting and in addressing the problems that the European farmers are affecting. Also the crisis that is investing and is challenging this industry. For the next multi-annual financial framework, that is the EU budget for the next 7 years, the Italian government is campaigning to guarantee more funds to small farmers in order to protect them from unfair competition from inside and outside the European Union. I didn't understand really well the question about migration and alternative media, but in general, the approach of the media on the migration issue is wrong. They deliver wrong informations. We have some alternative media that is trying to challenging the mainstream tellings and talkings about migration. But in general, the battle that we have to fight is about fair information, because look at what is happening at the European Union level. The technocrats that are losing their power in influencing and in convincing people that the European Union is a good project are failing in doing this, and without any ability to convince people with concrete policies and facts that the European Union today is a good project for them, they are trying to manipulate the information with the fake news battle that is something that is not new. Fake news is just another term for mentioning propaganda. Propaganda has always existed. So they are trying to reverting this in order to control the media and also to control internet. So it's very important to have free information and free spaces for information, especially on the migrant issues. The European Union is trying to block it. We have to protect it. You have to make your voice stronger in asking for more democracy and more fair information in the mainstream media.
Bonjour à tous. J'enlève le casque parce que excusez-moi. Madame Péchou,
I'm Madame Péchou. I am representative of NMP, whose president is Mr. Banakani in Cameroon. I'm thanking Mr. Jacques Cheminade to be here. I was fed with ideas during those 2 days, and I'm very thankful for this organization. Yesterday I wanted to ask a question, and I said I have today the time to ask my question. I was pleased yesterday to see a representative of African countries, and I said, okay, I will see what they have to say on the African development. Sometimes I was happy, and sometimes I was surprised by some propositions. Today I feel that I feel profoundly that maybe I'm mistaken if that is not a new phase of the France-Afrique, because there's something which I don't like, and when something is disturbing me, I have to tell it. I think that we can't do without the Africans. And what you said, you say, yes, there are projects for African people, but it will be done with conditions. And for me, those conditions are paternal conditions. We are not, we don't give credit to African people. That's what I think. And I feel that people are thinking that African people can develop themselves. So I can't be associated with people who are thinking like that. So maybe I'm mistaken, but good intentions are not sufficient. And there is a problem of form and also of ideas. I don't know if that's good defined, but I have a problem with this kind of policy, which is we are doing the work for the African people. That's the idea. My question is a little bit global, but I wanted to have an answer.
Le grand poète allemand Friedrich Schiller a dit au moment de la Révolution française qu'un grand moment de l'histoire avait rencontré un peuple petit. Schiller said at the time of the French Revolution that a great moment of history was met by a little people, small. So I think this we should have in mind at this moment, which is a key moment of change, not only in the politics of our states, not only in Europe, but in the whole world. And people have not enough thought of how a financial tsunami is coming that can shift completely things and create a catastrophe. And we have absolutely to prevent that. So if you want to work usefully in preventing it, I think the person, Lyndon LaRouche, who has for years and years devoted his life to say what has to be done for the common good and for the future generations, you should more study his works, not just think that you know, but going in depth, fighting inside yourself, and getting ahead in doing things, because if you don't do things, you don't really understand what is at stake. So this means that today, most things are in official circles, most things are like the managing of a dying system. Sometimes it's a very competent managing of a dying system, and it accelerates the moment of the death. It only leads to that. So if you want really to see what an African project means, you should think of what a project would be from what the Africans want, and we should give them what they need, what is necessary for them. It's not something imposed from above. But you should not think from top down. If you think from top down, you enter into the system and the values of the existing system, which are self-destructive. The way to think is to think from bottom up. And Lyndon LaRouche always told us, think from bottom up. And to think from bottom up is to think of the future of humanity as a whole. And I think with that, I must tell you, and I must stress that, to join the Schiller Institute, not as a good action or something that will be good for you, but something necessary for the universe, necessary that the motion of the universe is maintained by human beings in the right direction with a responsibility. This geological force that Helga mentioned about Vernadsky. We have this force, but we are not really conscious that we have it, and we are not really committed to use it. So there is this determination in ourselves that we should muster. And if we disagree with such and such issues, we should look at depths in what they mean and what are the consequences of the disagreement or the agreement. And then decide that you have to do something, because the danger is in front of our noses. And if you don't want to see this danger, we are lost. So we have no other choice than to win, and to win, we have to commit ourselves. And this is, I think, the answer that I can give to you. C'est la réponse que je peux vous donner, parce que s'il n'y a pas cet engagement,
because if there's not this commitment, at the same time for Africa, for the world, and for our future, then it doesn't have any sense.
Said before by Professor Köchler is extremely important in terms of what we have. We have signed all these declarations. We have signed, all our states have signed this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have signed the Declaration of Philadelphia on the rights of labor. We have signed our constitutions, all the principles in our constitutions, we are throwing them away. So let's take seriously what we have committed to, and let's do it. And let's do it. And I think that's the message that I want to convey at the end of this morning panel.
Thank you. Is your question very urgent? We have absolutely run out of time. Very short.
Very short. I have one question to Professor Köchler. You mentioned the collapse of the international law and order, and you suggested a very interesting option that if a reformation is not possible of the existing UN institution, there might be a good option to make a parallel institution. So my question to you is there any organization already on this world who has already drafted such alternative, suggestive new order? And would you think that maybe the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would be a good organization to start drafting such an alternative order? And the other question I have to Dr. Azima, very short. If you have all money of this world, how long would it take to realize your new energy projects?
Well, read the charter of the Schiller Institute, the founding charter, and become a member today. But please, go ahead. You have a microphone.
Yes, I will be very brief. In the text, which I have not read out, I mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as one of the examples. So I agree with you. This is one of the new intergovernmental structures that one could consider if one thinks about reshaping the global system and about making a new beginning. And there are also developments in other regions, as for instance in Southeast Asia, which one could refer to here. For instance, ASEAN would be one of the other regional groupings. So that's my reply in brief.
Well, regarding the nuclear fission, I've shown that Russia has already managed to solve a problem and has a working reactor. Regarding the fusion, I would first like to point out that the Schiller Institute has collected a set of information, how much money predictably we have to invest to make fusion realistic. And at the moment, I must say from the state point, at least in Germany, we invest per year half a Boeing 737. This is not even a full Boeing, so I think it is at the moment not possible to think about a realistic solution in Germany. And I hope that countries like China and America also in a good competition will pursue on this path.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time. We have to be here at 2 o'clock sharp after the lunch break, so enjoy your lunch and see you on panel 3.